My name is Jacinta Thompson and I'm the Executive Director and Events and Exhibitions Producer for the Bob Hawke Ministerial Centre. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia. In doing so, I take this opportunity to acknowledge that the University of South Australia is on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land, and acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. So thank you for joining us for Stella Day Out, a one-day literary festival that celebrates the outstanding contribution of women and non-binary writers to Australian literature. We're thrilled to be presenting today's event with Stella, and I would like to thank Fiona Sweet and Claudia Lankavis for all their wonderful work in bringing these outstanding authors together. In our first session this morning, Hannah Kent, in conversation with Joe Case, will explore belonging and hope as they discuss Hannah's novel, Always Home, Always Homesick. And a very warm welcome to both Hannah and Joe. Thank you for joining us. This session is being recorded and will be available on the Hawke Centre website next week. And I encourage you to bring this to the attention of friends and colleagues who could not join us today. We are also live streaming this presentation, and I welcome our online audience, wherever you are. Hello. And as we are recording, can I please ask that you switch your phones to silent to avoid interruptions? And also just to mention that we've got a beautiful exhibition of Luicha O'Donoghue in the gallery. So after this session, if you want to go and have a look at that, I know some of you are staying for the next two sessions, so please feel free to wander in and out. Not during the presentation though, please. Okay, I'm going to finish, and please a warm welcome to Hannah and Joe. Thank you.
How lovely to be here on a Thursday morning and with Hannah and for the Stella Prize. I'm the Deputy Senior Editor of Books and Ideas at The Conversation, and when I met Hannah nearly 15 years ago, she was a PhD student who was years into writing this incredible sounding historical novel about the last woman executed in Iceland. I was always impressed by Hannah's single-minded dedication to her craft, and I would often think that's what a true writer looks like. Like, she was doing it. I talked about it a lot, I did it a bit, but she was like really dedicated. That novel, of course, was Burial Rites, which famously sold at international auction and became a world bestseller. It won so many prizes, it would take too long to go through them all. But it was, of course, shortlisted for the Stella Prize, and also for its inspiration, the Women's Prize for Fiction in the UK. I've read and loved all of Hannah's three historical novels, Burial Rites, The Good People, and Devotion. All of them are deeply rooted in place. They all wrestle with the contradictions of being human, and they're all imbued with wonder. In these novels, Hannah breathes vivid life into women of the past and renders their worlds in cut-glass detail. I was really interested to see how Hannah would approach the inherently different form of memoir for this book, Always Home, Always Homesick. To be honest, not all good fiction writers produce good life writing, and vice versa. But Hannah can evidently do it all. She also writes poetry. Perhaps it's because her books are so deeply researched before she builds her characters, which means that she's making patterns and meaning from accumulated observed details, which is something that good memoirists do too. You can tell I sat down and thought about, like, how is she also doing this? There's also, as fans of Hannah's novels will recognise, a real poetry to her language, which carries over into her memoir. Always Home, Always Homesick is a biblio-memoir. It's the making of a writer and of a book, Burial Rites, and a body of work. The book also charts the influence of Iceland on Hannah and her development as a writer. I was deeply moved to read this evocation of a sensitive, bookish childhood, and I was really awed by Hannah's detailing of the enormously rigorous, detailed and passionate period of research, writing and rewriting her first novel. And as I've said, I kind of was there a little on the sidelines, and I'm still amazed to realise just how much was in it. And I think anyone who's interested in writing themselves, or just going behind the scenes of a writer, this is a great book to read. So I'm really pleased to be able to chat to you about this, Hannah.
Thank you, Jo. I think that's the nicest, most lovely introduction I've ever received. I feel like I could just step off and thank you so much.
I won't tell any of the others. Hannah, I wonder if we can just start by I'd like to start by asking you why you decided to write this book, and the story of your relationship with Iceland and the making of Burial Rites.
It's funny, occasionally I've been asked where I get my ideas from, which I think is a very common question offered to writers. My answer has always been, this is before memoir even sort of crossed my mind, that the ideas always tend to find me. I always feel like I'm being pursued by something, sometimes in a lovely way, the sense that there's something wonderful and exciting and creative encroaching on my world and my days, and sometimes also in a sense that eventually I'm going to have to turn around and face this idea. It's not going to leave me alone, and it's something that I have just to move through to get past and to sort of shed it. An exorcism sometimes. And this was absolutely the case for this memoir. I had previously told my friends, several of whom were memoirists, that I would never write a book about my own life. The reason being, there were probably two reasons. One, I didn't feel like I could offer up that kind of vulnerability. I felt that I was already doing that in my novels, in a veiled way. But the second reason, which was really the more important reason in my mind, was I never thought that I had done anything that interesting. That was the reason why I was interested in characters and in fiction. I was interested in other people's lives, and I didn't really like the prospect of returning to my own with the kind of, forensic consideration that, for example, I might bring to my novels. And then I found myself struggling to write my third novel, Devotion. I had just given birth to my second child. He was born 6 days after we went into the first national lockdown for COVID. And I found myself in a state of complete disorientation. I was completely alienated from language. I would forget simple, ordinary words because of fatigue and anxiety. I felt very cut off from the world and very cut off from myself too as a person. I was a parent, and I didn't know how to write as a parent. It wasn't really something I had done yet. And it was in this time and place where I was dealing with these concerns and this feeling that words were no longer within my easy reach. And not just for the sense of writing, also that I no longer had language, which had always been this my means of divining greater truths in the world, had always been my way of making sense of things. I no longer had that. I started to become quite unhappy, I think. And it was around this time that I started to dream. In my unhappiness, I started having these very significant dreams about Iceland. Every single night, I would dream that I was in Iceland. And because my sleep was so fractured from having a newborn and breastfeeding, I would often kind of be looping back towards this extraordinary landscape, which I had always, and now, specifically at this time with lockdown, could not return to, that I missed very deeply, and back to this small, closeted, very domestic world. And around this time too, my mother, who's actually here today, in her brilliant sense of timing, she'll forgive me for saying this, decided to drop off a massive box of old stuff from my childhood, right at the time where I was very unlikely to be able to sort through it. And I remember in the midst of these dreams, in the midst of this concern of not being able to write a book, I did sit down with this box and I started pulling out these emails and these notebooks and all these sorts of things that I had clearly kept from my time away in Iceland when I was 17 years old, when I lived there for a year. And it was through reading them that I began to get this awareness that Iceland really had acted as this massive moment of redirection in my life when I was 17 years old. It gave me an appreciation of not only how much it had pushed me towards writing in myriad ways, but also the ways in which it had formed me as a person. And I think being in that moment of feeling alienated from myself and alienated from writing and being very unsure of what to do, having this yearning to be directed once again, I thought, I need to think about this. I need to actually re-examine those years and what they did to me. And that was really where that's my very long, convoluted way of saying where the idea for the memoir came from. But the more I thought, I'll kick it down the path, I ended up writing Devotion. It just kept following me. I thought, no, okay, this is a story that is asking to be told, and maybe now is the time to tell it.
That's really interesting that you write in the book that Iceland was your original land of redirection, and then when you're seeking redirection, that's where you're going back to that.
Yeah.
I wonder if you might share with us just a little bit from the beginning of the book that will speak to some of these things you've just been talking about.
Yeah, this is exactly the section in the book. Kveldvaka, evening wake, 2020. I stand at a place of wild liminality upon a shore of black sand. There is a raw and seething ocean before me, and the sky is a lowered brow. Behind me is a field of lava crowned with moss, and beyond that, a scoured glacier. The wind whips my hair against my neck. My skin is tight with cold, and I am alone and waiting. My waiting is of the enduring, desperate kind. Something is going to happen, and it shall be momentous. Something is coming, and I must meet it. The sky threatens blizzard. I recognize the heavy, yellowing pall of the clouds, and I turn away from the rage of the sea and walk towards the lava, stopping before a crevasse. Somewhere, deep within the dark rock, I know a river runs. When I wake, it is to the warm glow of a salt lamp and the sound of a newborn inhaling as he prepares to cry. My body, dislocated from my mind, is already pulling itself up against the wooden bedhead and reaching into the bassinet at my side. As the baby latches, my thoughts orientate themselves. There is no ocean here. There is no cragged lava. I touch my cheek, and it is soft and creased and bears no mark of cold or salted air. I am in my bedroom, my sleeping wife radiating warmth at my side, and this tiny creature, hand splayed on my breast, intent and quiet again, is our son. Again, I think, again and again, in one form or another, I am returning to Iceland. At 3:00 in the morning, our house is a womb. The bedroom is suffused with the lamp's pink glow, smelling of sleep and milk, tender things. I can hear a smattering of rain upon leaf litter as it drips from the trees outside, the hissing of possums in the feijoa. I'm in Australia, I tell myself. I am beneath the canopies of my childhood. Closing my eyes, I summon back the feeling of my dream. It felt premonitory. I come from a line of women who sometimes do dream things that are other and strange and not quite dreams at all. And there have been times in my life when my sister and my mother and I have known things, avoided things, warned of things dreamed. We don't usually speak of it outside of our tight trinity. It spooks people. But we three know the feeling of these not dreams, and I recognize it in that northern sea, in the boom of its crashing waves and their spray against my face and the hidden river running to meet it. I lick my lips and anticipate salt. I wait for a greater understanding. But it is gone. I open my eyes to switch the baby to my other breast, and the fugue that might have offered meaning dissolves in the realities of the t-shirt stretched down my front, the horror novelty of veins across my chest, the mug lipped with stains on the bedside table. I stare at the unread books stacked precariously beside it and feel dumb with fatigue. I am supposed to be writing my third novel. In a recent mood of forced optimism, I brought in a pile of titles for research I should, by now, have already read. I have not read them. I have not been reading anything. These past 2 years of unremitting exhaustion have acted like a riptide on my mind. I have been dragged beyond language. I notice that my son is finished, his mouth finally slack on my nipple, a thread of milk running down his cheek. I place him on my chest and feel his entire weight balanced over my heart. The wound on my abdomen twinges as his eyelashes flutter against my neck. He is more than what I may hold. He is dreaming of his own strange landscapes. Stop.
Beautiful. Okay, I love that we now have that context for our conversation, and that introductory passage just brings together so many of the themes of the book, you know, dreams, language, Iceland, you as a writer. In a moment, I think we'll talk about how you first came to Iceland, but I'd like to just rewind a little bit first to ask you about one of the things that I really loved reading about in this book, and that in fact show, you know, you were talking about thinking you would never write a memoir because you didn't think you could tap that vulnerability. And one of the things that I really loved was that you do this beautifully about yourself as a child, and thinking about how you as a child became, you were always going to be a writer, I think, from this. You write about your early feeling of not quite belonging or speaking the language of childhood, combined with a talent for deep absorption in your own world. And I wonder, did this play into you becoming a reader and a writer?
Yeah, undoubtedly. I was a very sensitive kid. I used to cry all the time. I think my parents understood why. Lots of other people didn't, and would become quite frustrated with me. I felt things very deeply. My earliest memories are of just having kind of this incredible intensity of feeling and not really knowing what to do with that. And I think one of the reasons why I became such an early and avid reader is because words provided some understanding, both of myself and the things that I was experiencing, but also of the wider world and the things that I kind of found unfathomable or beyond my childhood understanding. Certainly, I also thought that words were very beautiful. And when my parents were great at reading to me. They did that all the time. And I think I also taught myself to read at a quite early age through a lot of memorization. My mother tells a story of me insisting that she read me Goldilocks and the Three Bears every single night for over a year. And she did so. But I'm pretty sure that's how I learned how to read. And certainly, yeah, I remember as soon as I worked out that these portals which I had discovered, these entry points into other worlds and deeper understanding and other characters and adventure and sometimes the things that I was too scared to do myself in real life, as soon as I realized they were written by people, that these were creations, you know, I wanted to learn how to be one of those creators. I wanted to be able to kind of wield that magic that I found in them.
Yeah, lovely. I think a lot of writers have that kind of ability to immerse, or like are even drawn to immersing themselves in their own world, and also a lot of great writers have that insider-outsider kind of element to them where they can watch and then immerse themselves in things. So yeah, that I loved reading about how that applied to you. And in the book, you chart the evolution of this self who stands apart and watches to a teenager who works really hard to earn an authentic place in a new community in Iceland, this other world that you've chosen to become a part of. And I felt like both elements, this outside observer and then this integrated community member, were really integral in the creation of Burial Rites, your first novel. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about that, and also, is that something that you were deliberately charting in your memoir,
Yes, I think a lot of, one of the extraordinary things I discovered through writing this memoir, through doing life writing for the first time, is, it's also the beautiful thing about hindsight, right, is the patterns emerge in ways in which they don't always when you're living them. You start to see a lot of cause and effect, and even, thematic things that come up again and again. And certainly that was something that became very clear to me of how long I have often felt or identified as being an outsider for all sorts of reasons, and they have changed throughout the course of my life. And I don't mean that in a sad way at all. I mean that as someone on the periphery watching in, someone with a very good view who likes to be a little separate, maybe for that vantage point. But I don't think I really started to appreciate that in any concrete sense myself until I was in Iceland. I was not someone in high school who had a very strong sense of what I ought to do with my life. I knew that I should probably go to university or TAFE. I didn't know what it was that I should study. From a very young age, my parents encouraged me to, if I was going to be a writer, which I had announced, I think, at age 6, I should also look into being something else.
A writer and.
A writer and, always the and. And by the time I sort of reached my final years of high school, it was this something else, which started to give me a lot of, I felt paralysed. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what I should be. I had started having kind of these deeper philosophical quandaries about what it is to live a good life or a meaningful life, what it is to truly live as opposed to just kind of go through the motions. And this was around the time that my grandfather died, and he was the first person I very deeply loved I had known who had passed away. It was out of the blue, and it kind of thrust me ever deeper into this kind of philosophical wondering of what should I do and who should I be? And around this time, I started thinking a lot about awe and wonder and how these were the characteristics of my grandfather that came up a great deal at his wake and his funeral. These were the things people treasured about him. He had this incredible capacity and love of beauty, and natural beauty particularly, and this very, I think in some ways a very spiritual love of life. And so when I was at high school, in these early months of my year 12, not knowing what I should do, and the counsellor announced that the local Rotary Club were offering these opportunities for people to go live overseas for 1 year, I knew immediately that this was for me. The thing with Rotary exchanges is that you don't get to choose where you're going to go. I remember it was enough for me to be able to live overseas for 12 months. And then when they asked me what countries I would like to be considered for, I thought, well, I've never seen snow. That might be useful. I might enjoy doing that. That sounds something that might be wondrous. And I think I popped down Norway and Sweden and Finland or something like that. And then during the process of being interviewed, I was asked how I would feel if I was sent somewhere where it was dark almost 24 hours a day in winter. And I was like, that sounds fascinating. I would love to experience something like that. How extraordinary. And I swear that was the moment they decided. And I was the only person they sent to Iceland, whereas, 5 people to Belgium, 5 people to the US. And so I did. I ended up landing in this very, a small country. At the time, Iceland only had a population of 250,000 people. But not only was I not in the capital, in this of a small country, I was also up north in a very small fishing village. And I arrived in January in the midst of all this darkness. I was placed with a family and a host brother who refused to speak to me. And I realised very quickly that everyone knew who I was. So I had this extraordinary experience of, say, for example, walking to high school. I had to attend as part of the exchange through this ice and darkness and snow and these winds that would just come roaring in from the Arctic, and having cars pull up next to me as I was walking and me sort of freezing in fear and the windows being rolled down and all these faces sticking out and then sort of muttering to themselves in Icelandic, which was a language I had not experienced outside of a few occasional Björk lyrics. And then I would hear my name and I realised they were like, oh yeah, that's Hannah, that's the Australian exchange student. They're like, yeah, that's her. Roll up the windows and keep driving. And, so it's this bizarre sort of, yet at school no one would speak to me. And I think that I'm being a shy person, all attempts at conversation, this was a place where people's friendship groups were set in stone before they finished preschool. And so for the first time I found myself, yes, absolutely an outsider, a very conspicuous outsider, but also someone who was made even more kind of there was a claustrophobia to that, just to how conspicuous I was. I was very self-aware of my own status in this town as an outsider, as someone who was outside language, as someone who was living in a country, in a culture without access to that country and culture, and not really any idea of how to find a way to belong. And so what did I do? I started writing and I started reading and I tried to decode my experience through literature.
Yeah, and you learn the language of Icelandic, and that is not only opens you up to being a person who can tell this amazing story that you find, but to become a part of this community and this culture. And then a layer of that is you're being an outsider looking at this story is helpful, but even more perhaps being an insider because you know this language and you make all of these connections which lead you to finding out more about this story. I just loved that contrast, that balance. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, the language, learning Icelandic was integral to my experience there in more ways than one. Certainly in learning about the true story which you mentioned, the woman, the last person to be executed in Iceland. It happened at around the same time. I think my interest in this story and the first time I discovered it coincided too with my first kind of discovery of a door into the language. What had happened was one night my host father, a very quiet, tall man who didn't really speak to me, came to my bedroom door and said, "Okay, Hannah, we're going to go now." And I was like, I don't really remember that we have to go anywhere, but so much was being lost in communication, I just went with him. And he drove me down to the industrial part of the town near the fishing factory to this warehouse which looked abandoned. And he told me to get out, and I did, and I thought, I'm definitely going to die. And I follow him, not knowing what else to do, through the snow, up the stairs of this warehouse, and we get to the top, and he's like, "Okay, I'll come and pick you up in about 2 hours." And I'm like, "I'm sorry, where are we?" And then the door opens, and I realize I'm standing in this room with about 15 other people staring back at me like, "What are you doing here?" And they're all smoking and drinking coffee, and he's like, "Okay, yep, okay, bye." And he leaves. And there's this moment of really awkward exchange. One of them speaks to me in Icelandic. I don't understand. I'm saying, "I'm sorry, I'm Hannah, I'm the exchange student." They're like, "Oh, okay, yeah. Oh, so what are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm sorry, what are you guys doing here?" Like, what's happening? And they said, "Oh, we're the theatre company in this place. We're rehearsing a play." And I think your host father thought that maybe you wanted to be on the stage with us. And I was like, "Yeah, that sounds great." And they're like, "But you don't speak Icelandic." And I was like, "No, I don't." And so they're like, "Oh," and they're kind of looking at each other. Eventually they go and they have a little huddle, and then one of them comes back and says, "Okay, so we have been thinking about this, and we were wondering if perhaps you would like to be our slave." And at this stage, I was so desperate to belong to anything. I was like, "Sure, yes." And then they're like, "Okay, great, because we actually we really need somebody to come and to mop up the blood." Like, the blood. And they're like, "Yeah." And then eventually it all starts to come out. They're realizing I'm sort of, staring at them bug-eyed. And they explain to me that the play is about 6 people who die on stage and then finish the rest of the play as ghosts. And they want me to be the props girl, the person behind the stage who's mopping up all the fake blood, who's setting off the gunshots and the nooses falling from the beams and all these sorts of effects. And I do. And then, of course, I realise that even though I'm not acting on stage, I still need to have enough knowledge of Icelandic to be able to make a correlation between what I'm hearing on stage as cues and the script in front of me. And so I start memorising the script. And this is the first time I really start to get a grasp on Icelandic. But of course, my vocabulary from the outset is blood, blóð, murder, morðingi, all these sorts of words. So this is kind of where my head is at when suddenly I'm being driven by my host parents down towards the south of Iceland. And they're incredibly quiet and silent in the car, as they always are. And I don't know if anyone's been to Iceland, but northern Iceland, it's just an exquisite, I don't know, it's a wilderness. It's the most beautiful landscape, one of the most extraordinary landscapes you can be in. Nature has such a, I think in some times where we are, we can forget the presence of nature. We're inside, we're in artificial heating and lighting, and driving through North Iceland, you are such a small part of this place that you cannot but be humbled by what you see outside of the car window. And I was in this state of utter reverie and awe driving through this landscape when we rounded the corner of a mountain. And there are no trees, really, in northern Iceland, so you can see for an extraordinary distance. There's also very little air traffic over Iceland, so the air is incredibly pure, which means you can actually see a lot further than you can ordinarily, say, in Australia. And I was gazing out for kilometres, it seemed, over these valleys, these mountainous valleys. We round the corner, and suddenly the landscape erupts in these small hills. And it's extraordinary. It looks like something out of a dreamscape. And my curiosity was enough for me to broach the silence in the car and ask my host parents whether these were Viking burial mounds or something like that. And they said, no, it's not that. These were a snöflod, an avalanche. These were caused by an avalanche. But they said, it's interesting that you point out this place because over there, and they pointed to these 3 hills standing together, those 3 hills are called Tristapar. And that is where the last person in Iceland was executed. And I was immediately intrigued, I think, probably, because I had the first, the murder words, the blood words, the haunted words in my head, and also because it was such an extraordinary place. And I was like, well, what happened? What did he do? And they said, no, it was a woman. It was a woman called Agnes Magnusdóttir, and they cut off her head by broad axe. I was like, why? They said, she murdered these 2 men, and then she burnt down the farm where they were living, the old Icelandic turf farm. And there was another 2 people involved, and also a man. He was also had his head cut off. And I immediately asked, as I think anyone would, but why did she murder these men? And they couldn't really give me an answer. They said, some people think that one of the men who died, he was her farmer, he was her, her boss. And lots of people thought that maybe she was in love with him and he didn't want her. So she went crazy and killed him. And I wasn't really satisfied with this answer, as I don't think many people would be. And I think I kind of let it alone. But in the next few weeks, I started asking people at the drama, at the Theatrical Society, about this case. And I more or less heard the same kind of iteration of the story. And I think I could tell quite quickly that this was a story that many people were familiar with, but there was a lot of details missing. And there was something which I found deeply compelling about it, but also deeply unsatisfying. And this dissatisfaction, and also I think probably what I can now see as an implicit recognition of Agnes being someone who was also an outsider in a small Icelandic town, made me become, in my mother's words, obsessed with her, which then later led me to, wanting to understand who she was, not to find her innocent, but just to understand who she was.
You write about wanting to find her humanity and actively resisting portrayals you find that are making it, like a film that you watch where it makes her too much of a saint, it excuses her too much. As you were talking, it's so interesting that, as you say, that one of your first immersions into Icelandic in the community, comes from blood on the floor, wiping up blood on the floor. I wonder if you could talk a bit about the role of fortuitous coincidence in creating burial rites, not just in these discoveries that you've just outlined, also this just coming across the site. With your host parents, but also through the research process. I found that really fascinating. Where you for instance, have conversations when you're in the archives with someone who turns out to be an expert on this farm, and when you're staying on this remote farm, you have, when you're on an 8-week study trip to Iceland, specifically to research the book, you've been hunting and hunting for this particular book that has a chapter on Agnes that you really need. You can't find it anywhere. It's not any of the places it should be. But this man who you're talking to at the farm just produces it. There's so many of these things. Can you perhaps tell us a bit about that and the research process.
Well, that's the one you mentioned about the man on the farm is probably one of the more extraordinary stories.
Yeah, that really is.
And it was funny because even when Burial Rites came out, I was aware that so much of my research... I ended up giving a paper in London about synchronicity in the writing process because I was aware that so many of these very strange and meaningful coincidences had happened to me. But even in the process of writing the memoir, I discovered even more. Again, when you start to recognise these patterns and start to have a bit more distance from the events, you think, this is quite extraordinary. And I mean, I'm aware that with synchronicity, all of the meaning is being applied by me. I find these meaningful for deeply personal and subjective reasons, but in my mind, that doesn't make them any less extraordinary. Mm-hmm. But the story with the farmer, if you're happy for me to tell it.
Please do.
So when I came, there were many things living in Iceland which pushed me towards writing, and I ended up applying for a degree in creative writing when I was over there. They included teachers who busted me writing poetry in class, and then next class gave me books of their own poetry and just let me continue on my way. It included encountering remote farmsteads, 3 hours away from a bituminized road, and there's collections of over 6,000 books just lining the walls of the farmhouse. It's, the sagas, the tremendous Icelandic sagas, and the way they are so central to Icelandic cultural life, the way they are so central to the natural world, where you're driving through and they're signposted. So many stories came to me in Iceland from traveling through the nature there. It's quite an extraordinary place for people who want to write. Literature has this incredibly central role to Icelandic cultural life, and I would argue also the Icelandic identity. The word that I read at the first, before my reading, kveldvaka, it doesn't have an English translation. It's a practice which occurred really in the 19th century and earlier, when Icelanders, who at that time were incredibly poor, suffering under, Danish colonization, so these people who sometimes had to eat their own shoes of fish and leather because they had nothing else to eat, nonetheless had the highest literacy rate in all of Europe. And kveldvaka was the time when it was sort of the gloaming outside. You would come inside, someone would light a light. You all lived in one central room because you had a turf house, that was all. And you would all maybe, do some woolen crafts or mending, and someone would read stories. They would read stories aloud, and that's what it alludes to. Kveld meaning evening, and vaka meaning awake, but it specifically refers to this storytelling practice. So there was so much in Iceland which pushed me towards writing these little things, as well as a lot of direct encouragement. And I did end up going back and doing a degree in creative arts at Flinders. And then this idea, this Agnes Magnusdottir, this curiosity about what her life was like wouldn't leave me alone. It was that feeling of being pursued by it, in some ways of being haunted by it. I had many dreams about her that left me incredibly shaken, and I decided that I probably needed to write something about her. Initially, it was going to be a verse novel, which my then PhD supervisor very wisely pushed me away from, suggesting I probably couldn't convey 19th century Iceland in a couple of stanzas. And I started researching a book, and again came up against the same problem I had found when I was living in Iceland. There were myriad accounts of the life of Nathan Ketilsson, who was the farmer who was murdered. In fact, the story was almost always referred to as Saga Nathan Ketilssoni, the story of Nathan Ketilsson. And whenever Agnes appeared, she was described invariably as a witch or as a spider, or as, there was a play that was written about it, and she was always, the directions for the actress was always, she cackles evilly. There was this massive kind of stereotyping of her as villainous. And that absence of a true person, that absence of humanity, made me want to try and find her in the records. And I could find very little. And it wasn't until I received this funding to finally go to Iceland on a study trip and a research trip that I was able to maybe try and access some primary sources that would counter this stereotype, this misrepresentation of her. And one of the things that I went to Iceland knowing I would hopefully find was a book. It was called Engin má undan líta, which translates to No One May Look Away, and it refers to the order given by the magistrate of the district to the 150 farmers and men who were ordered to witness this execution. It was very much a statement of power when the execution occurred. And I knew from Iceland's wonderful book database that there was an entire chapter about Agnes. At the time, I only had her name, maybe the name of her father, Magnus, and I knew her date of death, and that was all the personal information I had. In the time, by not finding anything about her, I had then spent lots of time researching her world, her society, getting an understanding of how people lived. But I was really hoping, once I could get to Iceland, getting my hands on a copy of this book and reading about her early life. And there were about 6 or 8 copies that I could see were available. And one by one, I was going to these libraries in the south of Iceland asking for this book. The first one, they were like, no, sorry, we definitely do not have this book. It's not in our catalogue. The next one, oh, yeah, sure, I'll take you there. And it's not on the shelf, and I have no idea where it is. Hasn't been checked out in years. It's probably somewhere else in the library. Another one, they say, oh, yeah, I'm so sorry, this was actually destroyed in the fire. Anyway, I couldn't find it at any of them. All the bookshops I went to, it was out of print. The publisher had gone under. No secondhand bookshops could I find it. I spent days looking for this book. And so without it, I had to turn to the primary sources. And I did find Agnes and her life story. I found her in censuses and in soul registers and these accounts by local parish priests, going through, hours and hours of microfilm. Trying to find her, in many ways, was like trying to find someone in an unalphabetized phone book in the censuses, for example. But I found her, and I found so much of her story. And then once I had all this information, I thought to myself, I really need to sit with this. I need to work out how I'm going to make it a novel. I also need to sit with the absences, the things that I now know I will never find out about her. And I went up to a place called Osar, which was a dairy and barley farm. And they often hosted people in the summer times because seals come and stay on the banks. It's right by the sea. And I rocked up thinking, this is nice and remote, I can sit here. And the farmer's like, oh, nice to meet you. He gets off his tractor. He's like, my name's Knútur, but, it's great to have you here. But can I ask what you're doing? Because, it's not really summer when we have the tourist season. And I was like, oh, I'm a writer. I'm actually writing a book. And at this, they spring into action. He's there with his elderly mother. She goes inside the farmhouse. She starts dragging a kitchen table out of the door. And I was like, what are you doing? And she's like, oh, don't stay in the barn. You have to stay in one of our cabins. They had these beautiful little cabins. She's like, and you need a desk to write that. So I've got you a desk. She starts dragging this desk over, and they put it in, and they're like, we'll leave you alone. They're like, here's some food so you don't have to, worry about this. You just write your book. And then just as I'm like, they're so incredibly kind, such a wonderful example of how revered writers, even though I'd never published anything, are in Iceland. And then just before I start, Knútur says, oh, do you mind me asking what you're writing about? I said, oh, I'm writing about a woman called Agnes Magnusdóttir. And he's like, oh, okay. And I said, are you familiar with the story? He's like, yeah, I'm familiar with the story. And he's giving me this incredibly strange look. And then he's like, okay, sorry, I'll let you go. I have to go milk the cows. And so he leaves me alone. And then later that night, just as the northern lights are coming out, he knocks on the door and he's like, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I was thinking about this woman, Agnes Magnusdóttir, and I wondered if you would like this. And he gave me a copy of the book. And it doesn't end there. He says, it's so strange. I've had this book in my house my whole life. I never read it. And then I read it 2 nights ago. And now here you are. So there you go.
Wow. Thank you. That's such a great story. And you say nothing happened to you in your life. I do love that this book is it's structured as a story with revelations and drama, but it's all built around, the writing of a book and the becoming of a writer. It's very beautiful.
I was actually emailing Knútur the other day because I got back in touch with him to make sure I could use his name for the memoir. And he actually just very recently sent me this beautiful kind of reflection on the Norns of Norse mythology and the 3 witches at the foot of Yggdrasil who weave the way, the past, present, and future, who weave the fates and destinies of men. And, I have long thought this about the both of us, but he said, I really do feel like we were fated to meet. I really do feel like, we were always going to meet and talk about Agnes, because we did. He helped me translate so much of that book. And so much of that book then turned to be historical accounts of other deeply fortuitous and synchronicitous events, extraordinary dreams, foretellings, that crazy story of the psychic and the way in which Agnes's bones were eventually found 100 years after her death. So yeah, it's something which I still think and reflect about a lot.
I think it's lovely that we've come full circle here to, your book begins with a dream and with you being haunted by Iceland, and obviously that's something that's run throughout your history with burial rites, with Agnes's story, and continues. Just briefly before we go, I'd love to ask you about truth in memoir has been all over the news lately, and as it periodically is. But actually, I was really struck in reading your memoir by a conversation with your mother about your obligation to the truth in writing historical fiction. Your mum says at one point when you're writing that as a fiction writer, you have no obligation to the truth, but this doesn't sit right with you, and you write, "All my life, I have read fiction for its proximity to truths, deep, complex human truths." And I wonder if you can just briefly tell us about what that relationship with the truth is for you when you're writing historical fiction.
Yeah, I think that's true. I have always read fiction because it has felt true to me. But I would also point out that, I say truths not in a singular sense. Yeah. I think one of the beautiful things that fiction can offer us is that proximity. It's not exact. Anything written in first person, anything written after the fact, just through a mode of representation, is necessarily not going to be completely true. Everything's been moderated through a mind or through a perspective or bias and ideology. Everything we write is informed by the times that we live in, the people that we are. And that's true of the process of reading. I mean, I really do think that most books are completed by the reader, and the reader brings all of those other perspectives to them. They bring their own life to it. The meanings are always going to be slightly different. But I think that amongst all of that, there is an approximation of something which is true. And I think that's why we feel ourselves being moved by works of literature. That's why they can make us reconsider these same ideologies and biases and prejudices. And that's certainly something that I revere in literature. I think it's a little harder when it came to memoir. I was conscious of not lying by omission, but at the same time very aware that a big part of memoir writing is, I guess with novels, I've always struggled with not having enough information. Even after the research, there's always something that needs to be built. Fiction is always going to be there to cover the gaps. And I try to tie it to research as much as possible, but it's still speculative. It's a speculative likelihood. It's a fictional likelihood, but it's not, there's so much in burial rites which is never true. I have no idea what people think. I don't know what any of you think. If I tried to write your story, I might get close, but I have no idea. I mean, but this again offers us something. It offers us something more than what we would have if we didn't have that. But with memoir, I found that the opposite was true. I actually had an abundance of information. I had my memories. I had many notebooks and diaries and videos and photographs. And it came down to me thinking, okay, how can I still have an approximation of truth, flagging that it is my truth, my understanding of these events. My host parents, for example, the first host family I had, might have a completely different perspective of what it was like to have this very shy Australian exchange student. I might be the villain in their stories. Who knows? That's fine. They're entitled to that. I wrote my book first, but But I really, for me, a lot of the editing process came down to setting boundaries and, yes, omitting a lot of information. And yet doing that whilst also trying to communicate something which is true, something which is real, even if it is only deeply true and real to me. Does this make sense?
It really does, and I think that often is, that idea of balancing truths is such a key part of writing memoir, of knowing what you need to put in so that you're not misleading the reader, but also, obviously you're crafting something, so there's so much you need to leave out. So it's so interesting to hear how you worked with that balance, but yeah.
I think for me it comes down to intent.
Yes.
And I think knowingly, lying with knowledge, I think that's terrible. Deliberately misleading people, I think that's not on. I don't like that. Certainly I would for example, there were lots of things I didn't put in this book, but they were based on my memories alone, but I didn't have a record of them in my diaries or journals. I didn't have any kind of reference to them in all these piles of material my beloved mother dropped off for me. And so I left them out because, especially if they might have been, cast someone in a poor light. So I tried to sort of exercise a kind of ethics, I think. I think that's what it comes down to me. It's such a tricky thing. I really do think you can create a work of fiction which is entirely made up. I think, autofiction is something which really, really interests me. I think it's spectacular, but I think it comes down to each writer just having a moment where they reflect on ethical considerations of doing whatever it is that they're doing, and then deciding on their path and accepting that for themselves, and also being able to be honest about their process and methodology and what they even perceive to be these ethical considerations, because they're going to change from every person. So for me, when it comes to historical fiction, particularly events which happened, people who lived, it comes down to getting as much as I can right, especially when I'm writing about cultures that are not my own, histories that are not my own. For burial rites, I needed to translate this source material myself. I needed to make sure that even what was fictional was based on other lives lived at that time. So I had to anchor or tether everything back to fact. And yet at the same time, I still found myself going on Icelandic television, speaking Icelandic to kind of prove the validity of my research, and also acknowledging many, many times that this is fiction and I understand its limitations, even though what it is offering an alternative truth. It's about opening the doorway to a multitude of interpretations, I think.
That's really interesting, and I feel like that when you're writing historical fiction, obviously it's something in between, writing fiction and writing memoir in terms of truth, and also what you're signalling to the reader about what you're trying to do, isn't it? You could write something wild that's deliberately telling a story that's completely different from what you're researching, but you would need to make that clear. But with what you're doing, which is trying to tell the deepest truths you can, obviously you have a faith, a fidelity to trying to just do that in the best way that you can, and to know as much as you can so that you can. Is that kind of?
Yeah, I think so. It changes too. I think even if a writer, if they deliberately want to play and interrogate notions of truth, that's something that they should be able to do, and that's exciting and it's interesting. But just don't deliberately mislead people, and also don't mislead yourself or think that you're doing something that you're not.
Yeah. So again, that's about signalling to the reader if you are playing with truth. Or
I think it just comes down to a bit of reflection. Why am I doing the thing that I'm doing? How am I going to do it? Am I hurting people that perhaps I could avoid hurting? Just kind of common sense based.
Yeah. A mix of the art of reflection and just common sense, basically.
Yeah, maybe it's not so common, but yeah, I think it's...
Well, not making things up. And
I think so. I think so. It's always so interesting when memoir comes out in the news and people are shown to be liars, and I think that's because, as readers, we make ourselves vulnerable to other people's stories. We offer our own emotions, and we take them into ourselves. And if we are later found, we later discover that we were lied to, there is a sense of betrayal there. So I think that's completely understandable. But that's the choice that authors make. There's also ways in which you can write memoirs and you can write fiction and you can stop and say, actually, that's not true at all. Or actually, I have no idea. Or this is how it was to me, but I know that other people say that this never happened. I think you can say that. You can be reflexive as well as reflective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as we touched on, you started to write Agnes's voice as poetry, didn't you? And that, I think that comes through in the finished novel of Burial Rites. It's still very poetic. Have you thought about going back to poetry, or is that something? I was just very curious because you've gone from novels to memoir, and then you started with poetry. Is that something that you still?
Poetry is where everything starts for me. Poetry, I think some of the earliest things I was, read to were poems. Poetry is what I read when I get stuck in my own writing. I so admire the concision and precision of poetry. I love the craft in it. I find it deeply inspiring. I read a lot of poetry when I write. I don't think I'm a tremendous poet by any regard, but it's something I would like to become better at. I did actually recently have my first poems published in a wonderful, in the Sala Artist of the Year, Julia Robinson's book, published by Wakefield Press. I was invited by Julia, who's an incredible textile and sculptural artist, to respond to her work however I wanted to. And I found that it was mostly poems. I mean, her work really touches on folk horror, and so I found myself turning to sort of, I guess, a folk musical tradition and those sorts of rituals, and poetry felt. I loved it. It was so much fun. I have no idea if the poems are any good, but I really enjoyed writing them. Now they published them, so, yeah.
Well, having read the poetic elements of your books, I'm sure that it is. But it's very interesting that when you're just invited to play and do whatever you like, that's what came out.
Oh, totally, yeah. I mean, I think play is so crucial to any writing practice, and I think poetry is a really lovely way to do that. I think because it's short, and you don't have to show any people. It has that same kind of heady thrill that you get when you're a teenager and you're writing your first angsty poems down. I think that actually carries throughout life, certainly for me.
To finish, I just wondered, another thing that's been in the news a lot recently, less than half of parents find it fun to read to their children now. But it's obvious reading your book that storytelling with your parents played such a key role in shaping your love of reading and writing. You write that you were born into story and word hungry. Do you consciously create that environment for your own children?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we always tell our kids that they've been read to since the day of their birth, which is true. I mean, that so much of what I have read to them has been deeply boring. So,
do you read them from the research you're reading?
I don't say that, as any kind of. I don't mean to be offensive to any writers for children, because it's a deeply complicated thing to do. I wish I could write for kids; it would be amazing. I find it much too hard. But my children we've always allowed them to choose their own books, and there's been some real bad ones in there. The kind which don't even have authors. It's just who knows how they've come up with it. It can be repetitive, and it's not always a pleasure. But what I have found doing that has done for my kids, who have not been, precocious readers. My daughter's really only she's 7.5 now. She's only just now really getting into reading on her own accord. But what I think that does, beyond teach them language, and phonetics and all that lovely educational stuff, is teach them the culture of reading. I remember my daughter, I remember there was a time when it was raining outside, and I found her in bed, and she'd gotten a book which she could not read, and she was like, "Look at me, I'm being cozy in bed and I'm reading." And I love that she knew that was something that you do, that books are comforting, that there's something that you can have with you, that you can keep company with them, that you can finish your day with them. That libraries are safe and familiar places, that books, they know their way around. It's a familiar place for them. And now that she is finally coming to language and to story, I really see that with her. She likes to read herself to sleep every single night now. I never saw this coming. I really didn't think she was going to be a reader, but she is, and it's because it's that, like I say, that familiarity and that comfort and understanding that books are something that she deserves to have, that she can open her own self, that it's like you're trying to acquaint your children with books in whatever ways, in a multitude of ways. It's not just about language. So yeah, I think it's incredibly important, and I love being read to as well. It's not something that has to stop at childhood.
No, that's true. And as you said when you were talking about the drama society that was kind of your entry into Icelandic and Iceland, it was reading those scripts and learning the lyrics to The Wizard of Oz in Icelandic.
Say Galdra Kallinn í Oz, 3 times fast.
Yeah, it kind of made you reborn as a reader and writer, on a whole new level. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, absolutely right.
Well, look, I think that's a lovely place to finish. Thank you so much. It's been a gorgeous conversation with you. So thank you, Hannah.
Thank you so much, Jo. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Jo and Hannah, for that brilliant conversation, and I loved listening to those stories about Iceland. Beautiful. I'm Claudia from the Stella Prize. I just wanted to thank you all so much for coming out here. It's an incredible